I'd now like to introduce Jonathan. Jonathan Coppess, if you don't already know, he's currently on the faculty at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and he's director of the Gardner Agricultural Policy Program. I'm assuming, Jonathan, that that's named after the late Delworth Gardner is my hunch. I don't know that for sure, but I think he was a big guy in ag policy. If I got that wrong, never mind. He's already authored a book on the fault lines of farm policy, legislative and political history of the US Farm Bill. So just from the title of that book, this is clearly indicates that Jonathan has thought about, written about, has ideas about both the history of US farm policy and where we're going with that. He's served as a chief counsel for the Senate Committee on Agriculture, and he was an administrator of the Farm Service Agency at USDA, I guess under the Obama administration. And in terms of his background, he's actually a Buckeye. And we expect him to do an OHIO at the end of the session today because of the game against Michigan State this weekend. His family farm is, I guess, in Darke County. Is that correct, Jonathan?
That's right. Yeah, Darke County.
And so he's still closely connected with our state. He got his bachelor's degree from Miami University in Oxford. My guess is political science. Is that, would I guess right?
No, actually, business marketing.
Okay, business marketing. Actually, my daughter's partner has the same degree from Miami. And he got his JD, his Juris Doctor, from the George Washington University Law School in Washington, D.C. So Jonathan comes to us with a legal background as well as a farm policy background, and he writes and works extensively with the Farm Doc group out at the University of Illinois, and works with a couple of my old friends and colleagues, Gary Schnittke and Scott Irwin. So it's a great pleasure to introduce you, Jonathan, to our conference today. And I'm going to turn my mic off, let you make your short presentation, and then we'll start having some questions.
Great. And Ian, thank you so much for a very kind introduction and for having me on the program. Certainly I take that a little bit of pressure if this is the last presentation and the next thing is the football game tomorrow. So, I'll try not to put anybody to sleep, try to keep things in an upbeat state, even though we are talking about farm bills and the wild and wonderful world of policy development. So like Ian said, I'm gonna run through some background, some basic sort of material, and then I welcome questions and as much of an effort to have a discussion, because really at this stage, we're a couple years out, and so there's a lot of unknowns, and there's really just a lot of the sort of initial work around thinking through what this farm bill will look like. So let me kind of walk through a couple things here. I took out a lot of the history. My habit is to always get really lost in history. So I've taken out a lot of the history. I will just focus on some of the more recent times. So one of the things that we've got to begin with on a farm bill is some definitional issues. And a farm bill is really a multi-year omnibus authorizing legislation. That's how we would technically define it. Obviously, it usually covers about 5 years. It's omnibus because it incorporates multiple legislative topics or multiple statutory provisions and areas within the agricultural jurisdiction, and it's authorizing legislation. One of the key things about a farm bill and what makes it relatively unique in the federal policy space is that we authorize in a farm bill mandatory entitlement dollars. So these are funds that go out without having to be appropriated. They create something called baseline. And this is under the budgetary rules of Congress. And so I'm going to have to talk about some weird sort of inside the congressional arena issues to sort of set up what we think about as we go through a farm bill. So the mandatory, there are really 4 large mandatory buckets of federal dollars that are authorized in a farm bill that go out on that basis without having to be appropriated. And they are the traditional farm commodity support programs. If you see in red here, this is a fantastic overview of the last 25, 30 years, plus looking forward by the Congressional Research Service. And they compiled this using the Congressional Budget Office data. So we've got the red bars or the traditional farm commodity programs. Green is our conservation assistance programs, crop insurance in the bluish color, and then the very large nutrition and supplemental nutrition assistance program, the old food stamp program that we call SNAP. These are not only the four main buckets of mandatory funding, because of that, they are the main political drivers of getting a farm bill through Congress. And they are also areas of significant political challenge. So as we think about the next farm bill and how it gets written and developed, there's going to be an enormous amount of attention paid on these four areas and how we think those things are going to shape or want to be reshaped. Now, I mentioned the word baseline. This is one of these oddities that has really taken over the budget, or excuse me, has really taken over the policy and reauthorization process in the last 20 or 30 years, is this idea that that the Congressional Budget Office is going to project current farm bills out over 10 years of spending and economic factors, and they're going to create what they call is a baseline of outlays or spending under that farm bill. So when Congress starts the process in 2023, and this is from July, so this one will be updated in 2023, but to give you a sense of it, when the committees start writing a farm bill in 2023, they're going to get a Congressional Budget Office estimate of the 10-year spending. And that's sort of represented in this chart here. And what's key about a baseline in the reauthorization process is that is the universe of funding that the committee has available to it to do anything. And so you have to stay under budget rules, you have to stay within that baseline spending over the 5 and 10-year windows that CBO estimates. So that creates a real challenge in terms of making changes to programs and policies. Because if you change a program and CBO thinks it will cost more money, you're going to have to cut from somewhere else because budget rules require you remaining within the baseline, and they require that any of those additional spending items be paid for by the committee. And so that creates a series of political challenges. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through it. This is the entire major mandatory buckets, including the nutrition programs. This is just the farm side of it. And so the main farm spending items, the Title I subsidies, conservation and crop insurance programs. And so you get a sense of a couple of things. Roughly speaking, most of the funds spent in a farm bill are going out through the SNAP program. That's largely because it is a large program providing relatively smaller levels of assistance to individuals, but anywhere between 40 and 45 million Americans are receiving assistance through the food program. The farm side of it's roughly $20 billion a year in the baseline, and it's split fairly evenly between the three major areas. And so these are the things that the committees will have to work with when they try to write the next farm bill. So I know this is an outlook, and I sort of said this at the beginning. We're really at an uncertain time just in general because we're about 2 years out from it. But I think the uncertainty is enhanced or magnified this time around. So this picture sort of gives us a sense of the path ahead is, it's foggy. It looks rather rocky, and there may be quite a cliff at the end of it. So I'm not sure exactly how to provide an outlook that is clearer at this point. If we were to look at the big issues, so what are the things we're likely driving farm bill debates outside of some of that baseline and budgetary issues that I mentioned? I think we've got a couple big ones, obviously, that we've seen the last couple of years: the market conflict, the trade and tariff provision or actions by the previous administration, the enormous amount of payments that came back in from the administration as they responded to the retaliation around that, and this really would have been maybe one of the biggest driving issues of this next farm bill debate had it not been for the pandemic. And as we are all very aware at the moment, sitting here online talking instead of in person, this COVID-19 pandemic continues to drive a lot of uncertainty in the markets around inflation, around politics, in our daily lives. And so how that impacts a farm bill, how that impacts a congressional debate, we don't know at this point what kind of continued fallout or set of issues we may see. Hopefully we are past it and in a real recovery phase by the time Congress gets around to 2023, but it has certainly upended things thus far and may continue to do so. And I think one of the things that I find most troubling and most concerning about any discussion trying to have an outlook on the next farm bill is simply that the amount of political turbulence, or worse, the things we have seen really unfold the last few years, and what appears to be a continuing deterioration in Congress and a continuing sort of intensity around partisan polarization and issues that are frankly tearing apart our ability to govern ourselves through our system. And farm bills have, at least until recently, been traditionally bipartisan, and they've relied on a broad coalition of votes and interests throughout Congress to get a bill through. And so this kind of political turbulence, this deep polarization and dysfunction really amplifies the uncertainties about how farm bill is going to unfold in a Congress that, like I said, has gotten very, very challenging to work through. And then finally, I think overlaying all of this sort of what may be even a bigger driver and certainly a bigger issue of uncertainty is around climate change. We just saw the Glasgow negotiations complete. We are seeing the painful sort of repercussions or consequences as climate change continues to hit us through wildfires and storms and whatnot. And so, the fact that in the next, between now and the next farm bill, we're going to see more of this, and we're going to have more drought or more intense weather events. Those sort of things are also going to have a big driving influence on policy discussions and debates, and everything from minor, or what may seem minor in the big grand scope of congressional policy, things like emergency disaster assistance, and what does that do for, say, crop insurance or for farm programs and so forth. I think the climate change issue is going to be the single biggest driver around our politics and policy for quite some time. And it is the scope of the challenge and the work that needs to be done is actually very hard to even wrap your head around, I think. If we go a little bit closer into the farm bill, and I promised I wouldn't give too much history, but I'll give a kind of a quick overlay. I mentioned the four big mandatory buckets. If we think of it in terms of the politics or the political development, how does a farm bill get through Congress, and how is that developed over time? It's really a coalitional effort. This is one of those major bipartisan omnibus bills that involves a farm coalition that we've seen built up since the 1920s, largely around the Midwest, the Western wheat areas, and the Southern Cotton Belt. It is combined in the 60s, has been combined with the food assistance programs, the food stamp program in 1964, which really stepped in and saved the farm policy debate, frankly, from a deteriorating state. And then really an increase in the environmental conservation focus in the 80s, particularly with the 1985 Act, 1985 Farm Bill that reinvigorated and put into a permanent law the conservation programs like the Conservation Reserve Program and so forth. But it's this three-part coalitional effort that really moves the farm bill through. It is the measure of success, that the more this coalition is functional and capable of agreeing and compromising and working these things out, the easier the bill moves through Congress. If some or all of this starts to fall apart, or we see attacks on one version and not the other, or one aspect and not the other, then we watch a farm bill debate really unravel and get complicated. We have some pretty solid examples of this. If we just take a snapshot of the last 4 or 5 farm bills, we really kind of start our brief historical bit here in 1996, when we decoupled farm policy and sort of massive reforms, that 96 Act, the Fair Act. If we look forward from that, the next farm bill in 2002 had what we think of as a budget anomaly. It had an additional $74 billion that they could spend. They spent the vast majority of that on farm subsidies. This was adding what was in the countercyclical program back in, continuing direct payments. So a massive amount of spending in 2002 on the farm side of it. As we jump to 2008, we don't see many major changes, but agriculture certainly had gone through some pretty significant events, such as the World Trade Organization dispute over cotton subsidies that the Brazilians won at the WTO, as well as the renewable fuel standard and sort of how that has really impacted our markets, particularly our corn and soybean markets, acreage issues and everything in this decoupled environment. But what's really been troubling is the last two farm bills. The 2014 Farm Bill took 3 years over 2 Congresses, and most notably, it suffered the first defeat a farm bill had suffered on the House floor since 1962. This took place in June of 2013. The House voted it down. They voted it down over a fight about SNAP and the requirements for the food assistance program. Eventually, we got the bill through, but it was incredibly difficult and a very big political warning sign about how the coalitional breakdown can really drive the Farm Bill off the rails. One would have thought we'd have learned the lesson, but we did not. And in 2018, House Republicans again pushed very controversial provisions around the SNAP program. The Farm Bill in the House became extraordinarily partisan and controversial, and it was again defeated on the House floor. And frankly, as Ian mentioned, I spent more time than sanity should counsel in the history of this development of this policy and of farm bills. And this has never happened. We've not seen a situation where 2 farm bills in a row have been defeated on the House floor or the Senate floor, for that matter. Now, the Senate in 18 passed a bipartisan, 80-some vote bipartisan majority because they didn't mess with the SNAP program. So we clearly have seen the last 2 farm bills really hit a tough spot over fighting that was partisan, that was very ideological based and concentrated on that one key member of the Farm Bill coalition and the SNAP side of it. So I think we can raise our first set of questions about the 2023 Farm Bill, built really around whether or not we see the same kind of effort, the same kind of partisan political effort to attack food assistance to low-income Americans, and then drive a split in the coalition and watch the vote counts unravel. If we get back in that situation, I think we see the coalition not only break apart, possibly turn on itself. You see the same kind of issues that drive the fight against SNAP to start looking at crop insurance, start looking at farm subsidy programs, and it gets really uncertain and extraordinarily difficult to move a bill. In terms of the outlook, again, a couple other things just to sort of keep in mind as we think about the state of play. This is USDA's net cash farm income numbers. And I've subtracted out the government payments and then put them in red here to get a sense of sort of net cash farm income without government payments and that layer of payments on top of it. And we just see this anomalous situation, at least since the turn of the century, the turn of the millennium, where we have just gotten in a massive infusion of federal assistance. What's more striking about this is the fact that a lot of this assistance has come through ad hoc programs that were not authorized or appropriated by Congress. If we look at them, here they are stacked up. This is the market facilitation program payments in 18 and 2019. And then the coronavirus food assistance program payments stacked on top of that, where by this count, using CBO numbers, we're above $53 billion in additional spending. If we think about it, here they are stacked up against our Farm Bill programs. And so we have actually, in the last couple of years, had far more federal dollars go out to these ad hoc programs than what the Farm Bill was providing. How this changes the debate, I cannot begin to guess. This completely upends what we have seen historically. And it certainly is an indicator of some real potential change around this and potential political backlash. That level of federal assistance will not go unnoticed in the political debate. If we also look ahead on a couple things, and this is using what the Congressional Budget Office is projecting prices will be for the major crops, kind of flatline. Really, the main thing that comes out of this from a Farm Bill's perspective is because of the price loss coverage program, which triggers on a fixed price in the statute, $370 for corn, $840 for soybeans. You got to have a market year average price below it to trigger the payment. And really what we're seeing is the two major crops in this program, corn and soybeans, are not expected by CBO anyway under this price scenario to trigger any payments. So that is going to factor in. By comparison, some of the other crops like cotton, rice, and peanuts would be seeing a deficiency payment every year if these price revisions stay as they are, and if the CBO projections around prices are anywhere near accurate. And so this sort of raises a question about what's going on here. And I really think one of the things that we have to begin to understand is there's this baseline game that we operate in and we reauthorize farm bills through really produces winners and losers. Because there is an ability to put it the nicest way I can, to have a much stronger negotiating position. So if we understand that we're operating under a baseline, basically a fixed set of estimated funds, then the size of the program crop really matters. Here we are with the share of base acres by program crop. You can see clearly that corn and soybeans are the biggest crops. We know that based on planted acres, but these are the program acres that receive payment. If we look at the share of outlays, we see a pretty significant difference. So roughly 91.4% of the base acres are in corn and soybeans and wheat, but they receive about 57% of the payment. By comparison, cotton, rice, and peanuts, under 9% of the base acres, receive about 43% of the outlays in the CBO estimate. And so these smaller acreage crops are better able to capture baseline spending. They're better able to set, say, a really high reference price and trigger payments every year, which is what we're seeing under CBO's estimates for cotton, rice, and peanuts. And they're able to sort of maximize the return of the program per base acre or per program acre to those crops. This complicates our political dynamic. It also highlights the challenges we see with this baseline system that we have to operate under, that it does produce negotiating leverage for the smaller crops. And that raises a whole lot of issues that I won't get too deep into right now, but I do think it is sort of food for thought about how we are designing programs, how we are working through these policies, and what really is this sort of fair, equitable, and sensible way to go about this. I think this kind of disparity and imbalance is going to be tough to carry. It gets even tougher to carry if the members of Congress who really support these crops are attacking other members of the coalition. So I do think, we see warning signs all over the place around this. And finally, I mentioned climate change. And these are just charts that I cannot even get close to replicating. That the New York Times put out sort of an interactive set of charts about looking at how these negotiations unfold and really getting global greenhouse gas emissions down. And the bottom line I take from this is just the scale of the effort that's going to be required to keep us at the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, the amount of carbon that we not only have to stop, the amount of greenhouse gases we not only have to stop putting in the atmosphere, but we have got to start pulling them down. What I see, the optimistic ray of light in this very difficult matter is a huge amount of opportunity for farmers and for farm policy to be an active participant in helping pull greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, store them in the soils as long as we can, and really start to think about our policy as operating in that space. Which leads me to my last sort of setup piece, and this is around the conservation policy. Because as we look over a long stretch of time, and there it is, this is comparing all federal government payments to farmers with those payments that are conservation based. And without a doubt, over a long, almost the entire history of these policies, we have paid far more in the support payments than we have in conservation. And so the conservation question jumps out at me as, what is the proper return on the federal taxpayer dollar that's going into these programs? What is the best and highest use of this funding? And do we need to be rethinking and reshaping how we set up farm policy so that it is keeping up with and relevant to challenges like climate change and helping farmers really manage through and navigate through this difficult set of issues and challenges? The simple piece of this is adding conservation practices like a cover cropping to your farm is going to cost money. It's going to have some management challenges. It's going to potentially increase the risk. So we need policies that are really taking that into place. And if we look back over some of these things, what we see is the sort of inequities in the baseline game and some of the other political challenges lined up next to this massive climate challenge. I can also see a situation where the 2023 Farm Bill presents a real opportunity to rethink things, prioritize the funds and how we go about this specific set of policies. But like I said, we're a long way away, and it's a pretty foggy path ahead. So with that, hopefully a little bit of background, but not too much. And Ian, like I said, I'm happy to take questions and sort of open up any conversations here in the unknown.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. I think you've given us all some food for thought as we think about what might be coming down the pike as the Farm Bill negotiations begin. So we already have 3 questions in the chat room. One of them, I think, is a question of clarification. And this is from an anonymous attendee who says, dumb question. What is the difference between outlays versus base acres?
Oh, no, that's a great question. That is a well taken point, as I should explain some of these things a little bit better. So outlays are what the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the programs and the policies will spend. So in a CBO estimate or baseline, they'll talk, they'll show year by year, fiscal year by fiscal year outlays, and that is the total amount of spending. And then the base acres are the program acres for the crop. So each farmer has a historic record with FSA, with the Farm Service Agency, about what had been planted on that farm. That's how we determined base acres back in '96 and 2002. And so this is that decoupled nature of the program. So let's say I've got 100 base acres of corn in my farm. I can plant any of the crops and I don't have to plant corn, but my program payments are determined by that historic base acre record that FSA has. So it's really, I use it interchangeably with the term program acres, because it's not what you're planting, it's not what you're growing, it's what the program has on record for you, and that's what determines the payment. So my field would get the corn payment because it has corn base acres, even if I planted soybeans or wheat on that field. And so what I did in that chart was I took the outlays by crop, and then I divided it by the program or the base acres to get an estimate of what CBO was telling us you were paying out per base acre, per acre in the program.
Okay,
Sorry.
So Jonathan, we have a couple of questions that are connected here, and this is provoked by the vote that's just taken place in the House on Build Back Better. So this is a question from Mike Eastad. He's one of our county extension folks. Hi, Mike, how you doing? Sorry we can't see you there today live. His question is, how might actions like the American Farm Bureau, is that Federation? Yeah, Federation, and other ag policy groups' opposition to Build Back Better affect the framing of the Farm Bill if the midterm election doesn't change leadership in the House? And then I'll just tag on a follow-up question from Jackie Fatka, which is sort of connected. And her question is, if the Senate approves the House version of the bill of Build Back Better, will that additional $28 billion in conservation funding be added to the Farm Bill baseline for the next Farm Bill? So 2 questions there, one about the politics, one about the implications for the Farm Bill itself.
Yeah, so those are great and and very astute questions. I should not be surprised given the individuals asking. So I'm a little reticent to comment too much on Build Back Better at this stage for a host of reasons. One is it has not been enacted into law. But I do think, it was Mike, I think you said, that asked about the sort of state of political play in the House. And I think it is a very good question, and it raises, I might take that in a slightly different direction, which is one of the things that we have seen in the last couple of farm bills, and particularly around sort of the partisan makeup of the House in particular, has been this intense focus on budget, spending, deficits, debt ceiling, and all of these sort of budgetary matters by the House Republican caucus and leadership. And what we have seen that do is really drive a focus into cutting spending. And inevitably, if we're cutting spending, the big focus and target becomes the SNAP program, which then opens this sort of political battle, this partisan battle, and this set of issues around the SNAP program and food assistance. That in turn really tears apart the coalition and complicates passage. So I think I don't know how to, I honestly don't know how at this stage of any of this, particularly with the bill still in that limbo state of not being passed, kind of how the politics will play out in the wake of that. But I do think that if we use recent history as our guide, if we come into 2023 Farm Bill process and you're hearing terms about, you know, cutting spending and you know, federal deficits and things like that, those are big blaring warning signs that we're going to hit, or sirens that we're going to hit this kind of partisan political match. To Jackie's question about baseline, it's a good one. Baseline is, as I understand it, and I'll just be perfectly honest, it remains a bit of a mystery to me on some of this. It's fascinating how this sets up, but the baseline remains determined by the underlying Farm Bill provision. So whatever Build Back Better is doing on these programs is not changing what was authorized or reauthorized in the 2018 Farm Bill. And so when CBO does its 10-year baseline estimate, it's looking for that statutory authorization. So it's going to take the CRP program as it runs, and I think it's like a 27 million acre cap, right? So that's a big determinant there for that program as to what they think it's going to spend. So this is not sort of revising the underlying, you know, it's not changing the fundamental programs in the underlying bill, which is what the baseline is built on. I am not, I don't know, I'm not sure how the rest of it plays out, to be honest with you. I think we kind of have to, I think it's kind of a wait and see. There's just, there are more than a few oddities in this whole, deep in the weeds of all the budgetary and statutory provisions. So I think my best answer is I'm not really certain how this will all unfold. I am fairly certain though that the baseline doesn't change that much based on the way it's written in the statute, but also the way that CBO is operated. That it's tied to that 1985 Act provision.
Okay, let's just move away from the politics. Let's move away from the politics of where we might go to. This is a question from Diane Shoemaker. She works in OSU Extension. She works on stuff related to livestock and to dairy farming. Her question is, I guess this is how people in the industry can get engaged in the whole process. She asks, recognizing we're a long way off, what are the effective ways for farmers and industry professionals to participate in discussions impacting the next farm bill?
Well, thank you, Diane. And that's a really good question. And I apologize. I'm at home today, working from home today, and male person must have drove out here. The dog indicated barking down there. So I apologize for background noise. But so we are a long way off from Congress rewriting this, but we are in this part of the sort of larger process in which there is, you know, a lot of talk amongst commodity groups and conservation groups and the crop insurance industry and others about what they're thinking. And so these sorts of conversations like we're having today are really taking place. And so the time for engagement, I lost my screen there. The time to begin that engagement is now or in the relatively near future. The best way, you know, there's a host of ways, obviously, you know, interest groups, the organizations and commodity groups, like I said, for example, are very active in this. And so being engaged with them, they have a whole process they go through in creating their policy recommendations and those sorts of organizations, because really, you know, a bill of this sort of size and scope with this many interests in it, there is a political sort of coalition outside of that, or outside of the congressional part, right? So those interests that get involved are usually working on it now. So, I mean, I hate to give an answer that says, well, it depends, but it depends on, kind of where you align and affiliate. A lot of farmers work through like the Farm Bureau and the Farmers Union and the commodity groups, conservation groups that have their interest areas. Land grant universities all work through this. And so there's a big kind of mobilization, might be a bit of an exaggerated term, but certainly a lot of that progression as groups and individuals and companies and universities and so forth get involved in thinking it through. So I would look around and certainly ask around and find one or create one. Always start your own.
Okay, so Jonathan, we have 3 questions, and I'm going to try and connect them because I'm looking at them and I think they're all connected questions, and they all relate to the politics of the Farm Bill and the issues over conservation measures and climate change. So I'm going to try my best to try to join together these 3 questions. So Jackie again, Clint Schroeder. Clint, I think I taught Clint as an undergraduate. He asked me a question yesterday and I remembered, I'm pretty dang sure I remember Clint. So hi, Clint, if it is the person I think that it is.
Well, see, now I'm really nervous. If this is a former student of yours,
No, I wasn't teaching him.
On my best game.
This was not a class on farm policy.
Okay.
This is why I'm asking the questions and not answering the questions on farm policy. And we have an anonymous attendee who asks a similar kind of question.
Okay.
So I think this is the way to break this down: is how will the 2022 midterms affect the 2023 Farm Bill? And if we see a switch to Republican control, how's that going to affect, repositioning with respect to conservation funding? Clint's question is, will the Farm Bill be passed on time given the current political climate and the desire to have more climate-related conservation measures? He does actually have another question about the ARC PLC programs, but I think we'll come back to crop insurance if that's okay.
Sure.
And then the anonymous attendee, very similar question: will climate change be accepted, addressed in the next Farm Bill with the divisive government in place at present? So I think all 3 of these questions are pretty much asking about the same thing, which is why I joined them all together. So back to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, no, that's, again, some really good questions, and sort of very accurate, looking at the indicators for the process and how it unfolds. Of course, we don't know how the 22 midterms are going to turn out, but as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the key issues is, that sort of combined change in particularly in the House leadership. And if what we see is if what we see is a repeat of the last couple of times, particularly the 2011 timeframe, which really kicked into motion the difficulties of the 2014 Farm Bill, in which that was the Republicans took over the House of Representatives. It was summer of that year of 2011. They threatened the debt ceiling, which is, I'm sure, esoteria within esoteria, but the debt ceiling doesn't change spending. It doesn't cut spending. It's our ability as a federal government to borrow to pay for the bills we've already spent and obligated. But it is the kind of thing that has become very political and partisan, has been used as a sort of hostage in the political process. If we see that kind of thing unfold, so if you think about the basic steps, a change to Republicans in the House of Representatives, if it is accompanied, I don't know that it would be, obviously this is going to be a big part of the campaign discussion, but if it is accompanied with this intense focus on cutting spending, on deficits, on attacking the White House and the administration and the other party, built around things like taking hostage over debt ceilings and budget cutting exercises, then I think the path to getting a Farm Bill becomes extraordinarily difficult, because we have seen it recent times. We've got very clear examples of it. It is a mandatory spending bill, and the biggest item is the thing that gets most politically controversial, which is cutting SNAP. Remember, when you're cutting the SNAP program, when members of Congress go after that, this is a program designed for low-income Americans to buy food, to feed their families, to feed themselves and their families. The level of controversy around taking down or limiting or making harder to get those benefits is really politically difficult and controversial. We are talking about the ability to feed yourself, feed your kids. And so there is not like there's not an easy button. You don't just cut SNAP easily. You're literally throwing people out of the program. That's normally how you save money, is you change the rules so people who could get the benefit now can't get the benefit later. Many people talk about it as unemployment, and it's not an unemployment program, it's poverty. So many people work and get SNAP benefits. Many of them are elderly, disabled, or children, so they get those benefits. So you can just, it's not hard to fathom that the politics around it get really difficult. So I think if the House flips and the focus is budget cutting, it's going to come after SNAP, and it tears apart the coalition. And I don't know what the realistic path is in that political scenario. I'm sure there are some, but I do not see an easy one there. And so I think that is going to be one of the key indicators. Now, you're a former student, climate change and conservation, and those are great questions. I don't know. Climate change is going to have two pretty direct impacts. One of them is on the conservation side. So the most likely investments that farm bills make towards climate change are through the conservation program, particularly programs like Environmental Quality Incentives Program that pay farmers to help or cover the cost of doing practices that will have that impact, like cover crops and taking GHG emissions out of the air. So there's a very direct. The other one that I think is that one we can kind of see our way through. The one that I think is the bigger unknown is this sort of disaster situation, right? Congress, like all of us, is very impacted by the most immediate thing that happened. So if we're watching wildfires, hurricanes, flooding, and other major weather events, we see a drive for massive disaster type assistance. And if so, how does that impact things like the crop insurance? We have a roughly $9 to $10 billion a year crop insurance program designed to indemnify farmers for losses from natural disasters. How do both of those things fit through a budgetary baseline challenge when we're, looking at crop insurance and then billions of dollars in additional ad hoc? It certainly undermines a lot of the support, political sort of support, not vote support for crop insurance if, the farm interests are arguing for these other payments when they've got this very generous insurance program. It indicates that program for some reason is not being considered to work for the farmer. So I think it raises some real concerns and issues that way as well. But again, that one's far more unknown. We just can't even begin to guess what we might see in that case. Like I said, I think climate change is going to be a major factor in policy development going forward, one way or the other, or maybe both, and then some more on top of it. So stay tuned with that. And I think that's where, frankly, a lot of energy and focus and, the sort of academic work, there's some incredible research going on around this. This is the kind of thing where I see both as a challenge, but as a real opportunity.
So Jonathan, can I just jump in there with
yeah, absolutely. Sorry.
A question of my own. I thought I was going to have to ask all the questions, so I really appreciate the people in the audience making my life easy a bit. We're hearing a lot of discussion about private carbon markets, and we had a panel discussion at our farm science review back in September, and there seems to be quite a lot of interest in how these markets might work. And of course, we had discussion coming out of Washington about the possibility of money being put in to, I guess, the U.S. government, the federal government acting as sort of a clearinghouse for contracts. But I guess my question to you is, as if private markets develop, does that relieve some of the pressure in the farm bill negotiations to either increase spending on conservation reserve programs or backing of focus away? So I guess it's that private public argument. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think I think it's a great, area for sorting through and trying to figure out and analyze. I mean, I think so. I caveat this with this is very rough kind of thinking, but and certainly oversimplified. First and foremost, if there's a private market developing around, it's going to take some time, and there is a transitional period that I think is really key to both a chance to develop that private market and to helping farmers get through it. It's not going to be there automatically. It's going to have a lot of, like any starting new opportunity, it's going to have challenges and there's going to be bumps in the road. And so I think policy, really thinking, I think this is where it's a really fascinating policy discussion and the opportunity to sort of get creative is how would you reshape some of these programs around this? What would it look like? We've been doing this, have Congress fix a target price in the statute and then we'll trigger payments. We've been doing that since 1973. Things have changed a lot, but what do we pull out of those to rethink our program design around something like a carbon market? Self-interestedly, the investments in research and outreach and develop, there's a huge amount of need to help build that up and make it work. And there are a lot of reasons to be skeptical or at least, have tough questions about what these things look like and, how they play out. So I do think there will be a really significant policy role in that. And I think just as we've seen with any market to date, farmers are going to need a lot of backstop or the sort of risk management provisions to that. Because I don't even think, a carbon market's not going to be the sort of thing that, is going to deliver all the time every year. We're going to depend on the weather. We're going to depend on how that cover crop establishes and grows. And so I do think there's going to be a pretty significant role for rethinking policy around it. But to your point, if we unlock a lot of private dollars to go into this space, then all of a sudden we start thinking about, and one of your former colleagues, Carl Zuloff, and I've had some really fun conversations and worked on this a little bit. We almost start thinking about of growing more than one crop by the acre. Instead of just corn, it is a corn crop, but a carbon sink. And or an ecosystem service on that acre. And so we have actually expanded the cropping mentality of the acre, which offers a lot of risk management opportunity as well as income growth for farmers. So I think there's a lot to it. And I think it can help a lot around, the cost, because the costs are going to be substantial to move through this. Not just for agriculture, but certainly in the ag space.
Right. Okay, let's switch to another question here. This is from Chuck Abbott. He has two questions. Given projections of a decline in net farm income in 2022, with the end of pandemic aid, will the farm bloc try to increase ag spending in the 2023 Farm Bill? And then the second question is, would the traditional farm program survive a breakup of the three-part coalition that you talked about in your initial set of slides?
Well, let me take the second one first. I do not see, but in all things politics and policy, it's very easy to be wrong. It's very easy to be proven wrong. Standing here in 2021, I do not see a path forward, with that coalition broken up or worse, turned against itself in some way. The farm support programs in Title I are incredibly vulnerable politically. They don't even go to all farmers. There's a very small subset of farmers that receive payments under those programs. And so the political base around those really has challenges. And to the extent it aligns with the partisan political interest in cutting spending, I think those challenges grow substantially. But again, a lot of this is to be determined. A lot of this is subject to change. As far as increasing program spending, again, one of the things that's sort of crazy about the way this baseline process works is that 50-some billion dollars in additional payments that went out the last couple of years were done mostly by the administration, some of it by Congress in an ad hoc appropriation or supplemental appropriation. None of that factors into the baseline. So to replicate that level of spending in any form or fashion under the baseline rules that we have, something has to get cut. So for farm groups to disaster spending or farm programs, increase target reference prices, or whatever it might be that they want to do that would be estimated to increase the spending, they're going to have to cut something else to do so. And that's where this coalitional politics gets incredibly difficult, because now you're not just getting more for yourself, you're taking from somebody else to do so. And so when we think in terms of understanding the political process through that coalitional lens, that kind of thing, even without budget pressures coming down, just the baseline game itself makes it really difficult to shift funding around.
I'm going to switch topic a little bit here, just because I want to take it back to Clint's question about if there's a delay in the Farm Bill, is there going to be a potential extension?
Oh, yeah.
But I wanted to ask you another sort of a big picture question, which is that I guess for the first time in nearly 40 years, Senator Pat Roberts is not going to be directly involved in a farm bill. So I guess this is the question I had written down, which is why I'm bringing it back to this, because we had a question earlier that you hadn't addressed, which is, do you see major changes to the crop insurance offerings?
Yeah, so I will be honest with you. I don't know how to factor in a farm bill debate without Pat Roberts. He has been one of the biggest players in this process since the 80s. And it is a loss of institutional knowledge. I still marvel when I talk my class through the 96 Farm Bill. I still marvel at the way in which, as chairman of the House Ag Committee, the way he navigated that, Gingrich contract with America budget reconciliation fight, and the way he got a Farm Bill through in 96, still, it's just one of those things that you're like, you just marvel at the strategy and the political ability to move through it. So all of that says it is a huge loss. I think, Pat Roberts was an institution within the institution on farm policy. And as you point out, his number one priority, at least since, 2000, has been crop insurance. And he was its biggest defender. He was his strongest advocate. And I worked on the Hill. I can tell you, everybody knew you don't mess with crop insurance until you talk to Robert's office. And then you usually, went through the ringer just to have that conversation. So they were very good at that. So it does raise questions. But look, I will say a couple things about it. One, there's a lot of, within the committee, political support for committees, there's quite a bit of support for crop insurance. It is proven to be a generally effective risk management tool for farmers. We've seen the push to expand it to more crops in more areas and more farmers. So it has that potential, unlike, the ARC and PLC programs, which are very limited in who can receive them. The crop insurance program can grow and has been growing. And, as we get better with data science and actuarial science, and we got better data coming in off farms, they're going to have the ability to continue to write those those policies for that program for more crops. And so I think that expands its base there. So unlike ARC and PLC, the crop insurance base, if you will, can expand. But again, if we're in the budget cutting environment, it's a $10 billion a year program. It's going to go into the lens of budget cutting, if that's the case. And you're going to go in that lens without, the traditional biggest defender. So how does that play out? How do commodity groups respond and farm interest? If they're asking for disaster assistance and more higher reference prices, how are they going to defend crop insurance in the same vein? How do you justify all three of those at one time, particularly if the work is to cut spending? So I think it raises a lot of questions, and it calls for some pretty serious thinking about priorities and how that advocacy work unfolds.
Right. We have another question from Jackie. I think you may have partially answered this, but I think we'll ask it anyways. She says, we've seen a lot of money being paid out to farmers through the CCC.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the new farm bill? So we're going to see more of that outside the parameters of the farm bill going forward, and more at the discretion of USDA to quickly react to immediate funding needs. I think you referenced this earlier, but I just want to give you a chance to answer this question directly.
Yeah. The CCC is a commodity credit corporation. So this is.
I apologize for the joke.
No, it's fine. I have a bad habit of it too. It is a relatively unique function in the federal government because it has direct borrowing authority from the Treasury, roughly $30 billion a year. And this is, while it's been used in new ways, the CCC has been around. Actually, Franklin Roosevelt created it during the Great Depression, and it was first put into statute in 1948. So this is an authority that's been around a while. We just have not seen an administration create their own set of payments the way the previous administration did. The question as to whether that becomes a new farm bill, I would have to think that congressional appropriators who have to pay the credit card, right? The CCC is basically a credit card for USDA. That is roughly the simplest way to think about it. And it's the congressional appropriators that have to pay it off in appropriations bills. And so they have historically, although they were very forgiving, if you will, of the previous administration's efforts, but they have historically not responded well to creative uses of the CCC, and it's the appropriators that can really limit down its use. So I think there's a big risk longer term that flexibility goes away if it's viewed as being abused by appropriators and members of Congress. And so I don't see that as a viable long-term option. It does present some important flexibility when really unexpected things happen. But again, if you're Congress, if you're the appropriators that pay that CCC debt down every year, we spend about 20 billion, 15 billion or so as it is. So they're going to notice if it continues to be used that way.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about budget constraints. My longtime friend, and you probably know folks in Washington who talk about this, but the MFP took us awfully close to breaching the US's commitments on farm spending at the WTO. This is Joe Glauber, former economist at USDA, has pointed this out pretty aggressively. But let's not get onto that because there's a few more questions. I don't want to go down.
That's a whole nother session to get into that.
So Alan Lyons has quite a different question. Alan is, you may know Alan Lyons. He was also one of my former colleagues. I think he's asked a question at every session, so he's getting his money's worth.
All right.
Well, he asked, how do you expect the growing interest in urban, local, small, new and beginning farmers to affect the Farm Bill discussion?
Well, that's a great question, and it is unfortunately one of the areas that has not received the kind of attention. Certainly, has not received the kind of funding that we've seen. My honest answer is I'm not really certain. They have worked, the previous 2018 Farm Bill really consolidated some of their programs to help create this baseline or keep this baseline so they have funding going forward. I have no doubt that the challenges that we're seeing with weather and climate change, are impacting farmers across the board. And so some of this push I've heard and read and understand that some of the push for ad hoc disaster systems is coming from specialty crop or the non-traditionally supported crops that really do not have a crop insurance program or any of the backstops. So I do think that a big part of that could come through there. On urban agriculture and some of the sort of initial growth, I'm not sure yet. It is a growing area. I think it's a very important area because it's really bringing more interest into agriculture and it's helping to increase all of our knowledge and understanding of how our food is produced and what it takes. I think there's a lot there, and they are certainly bringing a lot of growing political support around them. But again, we hit this baseline problem, right? There's a ceiling on what can be spent, and so who gets funding reduced in order to pay for more funding somewhere else? And that gets really challenging. And so they as a member of the coalition or growing member of the coalition really have a challenge with the other members. Who's going to move the funding around? So I think that's going to really make it difficult for them. And I'm not sure how that plays out, honestly, at this point.
So we still have a couple of questions left. We're past our closing time, but I still see 40 people online, and it would be really nice to close out because we've had lots of great, it's made my job as a chair really easy, because as I said at the beginning, well, I think Mike Eastad once asked me, he said, Ian, why don't you teach or talk about farm policy? And I said, you don't want me talking about farm policy. So me asking questions about farm policy is always going to be dangerous. So
you're too smart for it. That's right. You know better than getting messed in this muck, right?
Trade policy, I'm happy to talk about it anytime you like. But, so this is a question from Chris Sawyer, and it's circling back to climate change. Chris also works in OSU Extension. So he says, you mentioned there are challenges and opportunities in the next farm bill with respect to climate change. Can you explain what you see as the opportunities?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think the biggest opportunity you and I already discussed, which is the potential that private markets can kind of develop up and around us, and we start to see the potential that farmers are harvesting more from their acre than the commodity, but some things like ecosystem services and carbon capture, which creates just an incredible opportunity for new income streams, but also some real challenges about how to manage that, manage the risk and understanding it. So I see that as a big part of it. I think that agriculture can play an incredibly productive role in these global discussions. And actually, American agriculture can show some real leadership that we have this incredible land base, this resource that we can put to use for this worldwide problem, this very existential threat. So I think it's a huge opportunity to really demonstrate leadership. You know, even I'll just also add in from your perspective, from the trade side of this. You know, I think there's an interesting set of questions that come about as far as, you know, we spend money on market development, market access, and thinking through, as other countries are doing. The EU, for example, we've seen this administration talk about incorporating climate change into trade negotiations and other things. You know, my 2 cents is I think American farmers are very competitive at this front if they want to be. I think things like conservation programs and other assistance can help them compete even better. But you know, soybeans grown here in the Midwest compared to burning down Amazon forest to grow soybeans. I mean, I think in a climate change focused political situation, those two aren't even in the same race, and so same contest. So I think we have a real opportunity in American agriculture to not only lead on this, but to really take advantage of some of our competitive advantages and abilities and existing investments, and you know,
I'm hoping that
crops around the world that way.
Yeah, I'm hoping that trade in the environment does come back to the top of the agenda, because I spent a lot of my mid-career working on border carbon adjustments when it wasn't very fashionable to talk about that.
You were ahead of the curve.
The EU seriously thinking about considering this, and
yes,
agricultural economists are now starting to think about this quite seriously. But I want to come to the last question. This is from Mike Eastad again, and it sort of brings us back to this is a really interesting technical question. I don't know whether you know the answer to it. I think I have an idea what the answer might be. But anyways, it's a really interesting question, Mike. So a company like Danone, which is a French
yes,
dairy product firm, I guess we mostly know Danone for producing yogurt, I guess, has a sustainable milk program here in the state in Mercer County with no-till cover crops and manure management. So here's the question. It's a really good question. What country will get the credit for the offset for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions? Is it France or the United States? My answer to the question would be Danone has a subsidiary in the United States. The emissions are being captured here in the US. It'll be the US that gets the credit. But I think that's a really, really interesting question that COP26 doesn't even address, how we deal with a global carbon market in tradable permits, carbon, all this issue. We're nowhere near that yet. But interesting question. What are your quick thoughts on that before we finish up?
Oh, that's a great question, and you're absolutely right. Like I have just naturally presumed, right, that the credit's going to attach to the land or the actions on the land in some form or fashion. But I think what you said is really key, which is, are we even talking about, like, we've been sort of lost in a debate that frankly too divorced from these sorts of realities. And that is exactly working those things out, really important. Really important. I think it's a great question. Like I said, my presumption would be the farm field that, the farmer, the land that is storing the carbon through that process would be the one to get the credit, and that would stay within the United States. But international accounting, I have no idea. That's a great question.
Well, of course, we've never had, obviously the European Union is the closest to having a supranational carbon policy, and obviously in the United States, California is the closest to a state-based system. And in fact, California's even talked about having carbon adjustments of their own for interstate trading, which is as a lawyer, and as I'm interested in trade law, this is just makes my head explode thinking about it. So
there's a slight constitutional issue there.
Interstate trading versus who's allowed to make rules about trade issues. Is there? I have a paper in the Iowa State University Law Review about it, if you ever want to talk about that. So I don't see any more questions in the box, and I think we've covered many of the things that I was going to ask. And I guess my summary today would be that the climate change issue and conservation issues are one popped up.
It spoke too soon.
No, it's Mike. He says I have more great questions for Jonathan for a later date, and he says to tell you that.
Okay.
So I think thanks, Mike.
I love it. I mean, this conversation is great.
I really appreciate Mike's questions, and
absolutely.
But I do think today I wouldn't necessarily, having listened to farm bill conversations in the past, I wouldn't have expected it to go quite so much in that direction. But it's very obvious that climate issues, conservation issues, carbon market issues are front and foremost at people's agenda as we think about the farm bill. And I guess I didn't get to ask many of the very traditional questions that you might ask about, and maybe ones you didn't want to answer, like, what were your budgetary assumptions for the 2023 farm bill? So I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you so much, Jonathan, for this great session. I was nervous as a chair that I would be able to keep the momentum going, and I really want to thank the audience for asking so many great questions, and I hope that we answered all, or Jonathan answered all of your questions. And if I ignored any subtle bits of questions, I apologize, but that's just, that's the nature of being a moderator. So I'm going to call to a close this year's Agricultural Policy and Outlook Conference. I want to thank all of the speakers. That would be Zoe Plakias yesterday, Margaret Jadlowski yesterday. I won't thank myself, but I'd like to thank Seung-Ki Lee for talking about commodity markets this morning, Nate Kaufman for giving us a fantastic discussion about, general economic situation, and then tying it down to where the farm financial sector is looking, and through to Jonathan's wonderful discussion of farm policy. This has been everything that I hoped it was going to be these last couple of days. So we appreciate all the questions and answers. And finally, I'd like to thank Holly Davis for doing all the, I have no clue how to run a webinar. This is, my degree certificate says PhD in economics. So I really appreciate all the background work that's gone on, making sure we're all on time, everything gets recorded, Zoom works. And I'd like to thank Janice as well. Janice is always there when we run these programs. Normally, Janice would be helping us get the food in the right place, get everybody in the right room, et cetera, but I still want to thank Janice for being there in the background and helping out with the history of this program. So thanks, everybody. I wish everybody a very happy Thanksgiving, and I look forward to seeing everybody in the near future. So thanks very much. We'll finish and we're adjourned.